Hi everybody, TJ Mack of Vintage Cards and Nostalgia here, and in today's video I want to talk more about my collecting history. I've really been introspective lately, where I just want to look at my collection and how the cards have played an important role in my life. They've either marked memories in my life or have been directly involved in things that I've done that I just want to remember and share with my kids. So I started a playlist of some of the videos on my channel that I think my kids would appreciate, and it's open to the public, but I just wanted to put that together so they can always go to that if they want to just know more about me and just hear some different stories and see some cards that are important to me in my collection. Now I'm going to go ahead and get started with another memory here. Before I do that, though, my microphone hasn't been working very well lately, so I'm going to get a new one, but I did not want to make a video this week, so hopefully this comes through okay. So when I was a kid, I would visit my grandmother's in Daytona Beach, Florida, and we'd go every couple of years, and it was usually during our 2-week Easter break. I had one brother who was an older brother, so my mom and dad would pack up the car with snacks and luggage, of course, and then we'd have board games. And what we would do is we'd bring handheld electronic devices and packs of cards to help entertain us as we traveled down to Florida. It was quite a long trip because we were going from western New York to Daytona Beach, and that's about at least a 1,500-mile drive, so it took a while to get there. We'd usually stay one night overnight, usually in Georgia, then we would drive into Florida the next day. One of the handheld games I remember is this game here, Digital Derby, and it was these cars, as you can see here, that were on this film, and it would just spin, and then you'd have this car in the center here on a stick and the steering wheel to move it around. And if you hit one of these cars, it would light up red, as you know, to show that there was an accident. And it had a lap counter that would keep track as it would wheel its way through. And then you can go slow or faster by using the shifter there with the neutral 1, 2, and 3. And you could start over. It had the reset button there on the bottom. Just a fun little game I used to play when I was about 5, 6 years old. And it kept me entertained on part of the trip at least. And then we also had head-to-head electronic football and baseball. And then one of my favorites was this one right here. This looks like a reproduction, but similar to the original, Mattel Electronic Hockey. I'd bring this with me on the bus to school, and I just would play this on those trips to Florida as well. Just a fun little game. You can see here all the controls on it, and just had those little red lines that would represent the players and the puck. A lot of fun. We didn't know any better, as technology, of course, has changed quite a bit since then. Now, the first cards I remember opening on these trips were 1980 Topps hockey and football. And by this point, my older brother and I had so many of these cards from ripping dozens of packs over the winter. We used to buy them at McLeod's Pharmacy in Niagara Falls for about 25 cents each. Now, the wax hockey packs would show an image of a hockey player, and then it would have a piece of advertising below it with the words, "Who am I? Coin rub off," with every card. And it showed the fingers of a child clutching a coin as they would rub off the black wax coating. And man, this is why I love these cards so much. And I like them with the coating still on them because it reminds me of being a kid again. And if you turn these cards over, you can see on the back, I'll turn one over here, that they don't have a player's name on it. It just says the team and the position, and you'd have to rub off the wax that was depicting a puck on the front of the card to see who the actual player was. Now, for the good players, that was pretty easy, but when you got into the more obscure players that you might not recognize by a photo, you needed to rub that puck off to see who it is. Now, the football cards also bring back very special memories, and I can picture every Dallas Cowboy card in that set because I've seen them probably 1,000 times. There's a couple here, the Aaron Kyle, and you had Robert Newhouse, and they had a lot in their blue jersey that year, which bothered me because I always liked the white jersey better. Cowboys didn't wear their blue jerseys very often compared to the white jerseys back then. And then this set also featured the last Roger Staubach card. the NFL passing leaders. It was probably the first Staubach card I pulled out of a pack. I did open packs in 79, so I may have pulled his last regular card that wasn't a leaders card, but I do remember in 1980 getting the leaders card as he led the league in passing and then retired after 1979 due to concussion issues. So it would be a very long drive from western New York to Daytona Beach, and we just would see endless amounts of trees, especially in Pennsylvania and hilly roads in West Virginia. And we would just, play the games, rip the packs of cards, sort through them. And then my mom would pack sandwiches for lunch, and my favorite was tuna fish. And then for dinner, it was usually a buffet restaurant, as my parents were trying to stretch those dollars as far as they could. I remember on a trip in 1986, we started going to some pretty large flea markets, which were prevalent near where my grandma lived. And they would have these long boxes filled with comic books. And typically there were 5 or 6 for $1. And I would go through them pulling out book after book. And here are some of the covers I'd get. I'd get the Incredible Hulk, Archie. I loved Sergeant Rock. I was a big fan of World War II history. And here's an Iron Man they had. Another Iron Man with the Hulk. That was a pretty cool one. I liked Iron Man, so I'd get the Iron Man ones. And then I was really into the movie Jaws, still one of my favorite movies. And they had this action comic, Superman, from 1976, when the movie was very hot. And they used the shark theme, obviously, for the Superman comic. And I like the ghost stories, too. Those are my favorites, like Grimm's Ghost Stories. I'd get a few of those when I was down there. Some more Army ones, like GI Combat and more Sergeant Rock. Just would love reading those comics. These are the original ones I bought back then. My youngest son, really is into comics, and he reads them now. Just a lot of fun memories there. Just going back in time, thinking about them. It was in Florida when I really started getting into Dale Murphy more, because I would see the games on TBS, which we didn't have in New York at the time. And of course, Murphy was one of the brightest stars in baseball, winning the back-to-back MVPs in 82 and 83, as you can see here in the 82 and 83 Topps cards. And I'd also watch a lot of wrestling back then. National Wrestling Alliance, NWA, was on in the South at the time. That was when wrestling was still largely regional. The WWF started changing the landscape by going national in the 1980s, but you could still see a lot of regional wrestling at that time. And there I would see Ric Flair and Dusty Rhodes and Nikita Koloff, Magnum TA. And I would see them in my wrestling magazines, but I actually got to watch them on TV back then. And also in those days, you could rent VHS tapes of some wrestling matches when they would produce them for distribution. So I got to see those as well. But in Florida, I was actually able to watch the shows. And it was also in Florida that I went to my first ever card show and bought my first complete sets. Picked up an 84 Topps football set at that time, and these aren't the original cards from those sets. I fortunately got rid of those a while back. When we're younger, we don't covet things, I guess, as much, or at least I didn't, as I do now. And John Elway was one of the hot cards, of course, at the time. And then you also had Tony Dorsett, who's one of my favorite players. So I got that one in the set as well. And then you can see here I got an 85 Topps set that same year. There's the Marcus Allen and Lawrence Taylor from that set. And just love those cards, love both of those years. They take me back to my grandparents' place, and I would be putting those cards in those old stiff plastic sheets and an O-ring binder. And I would just go through them time and time again. The football cards were in team order back then. Baseball wasn't in team order, but football was in team order for some reason. So they looked really cool on the pages being numerically ordered, but also by team. And then I picked up the 86 Topps set when I was down there. And Reggie was my favorite player, so I wanted that one. And then also had this really nice Don Mattingly in the set. And of course, Wade Boggs was another one that I liked as well. So a lot of really cool cards from that era, and it just takes me back. And I remember also during that time some of the hotter baseball players that came out in that season. You had Teddy Higuera, who won 20 games. Really wanted the Doc Gooden out of that set. He was one of the hottest pitchers in baseball. You had Glenn Davis, who was second in the MVP voting that year, hit 31 home runs. when he finished the season. And then Vince Coleman was one of those awesome players, had stolen over 100 bases. Some very cool cards, some great memories from my time in Florida. And now I just want to share really the last big moment of my youth on those trips to Florida. So in 1990, I went down to Florida in June, Daytona Beach. And I had just finished 10th grade, so going into 11th grade that fall. And my cousin was getting married, and we drove down for the wedding. My parents and I did. And I did end up going to a card store when I was there. And I remember specifically buying the 1968 Topps Ernie Banks. I paid $10 for it. I got the 1970 Topps Reggie Jackson for $15. Again, not these are cards, but the same cards, just not the ones from my childhood. And then I got this 1971 Topps Steve Garvey. I think this one was like maybe $20 because it was his rookie card. And he was a very hot player back at that time, somebody that was held in very high regard. I think he still is to this day, but he was viewed as somebody that was a Hall of Famer when I was growing up. And just some good memories having these cards in my collection. Every time I see them, it really takes me back to that time. And when I was there, I also had probably one of my top 5 greatest baseball memories. It occurred on June 29th, 1990. I remember my dad and my grandfather drove in a major storm to the airport to pick up my uncle and brother who decided to fly in rather than drive. And my mom was worried about them because the weather was just awful. And I was in the hotel room that night watching the Oakland A's play the Toronto Blue Jays at the Sky Dome in Toronto. And Dave Stewart, who was my favorite pitcher at the time, threw a no-hitter, beating the Blue Jays 5-0. Then I turned off the TV, only to find out later on SportsCenter that Fernando Valenzuela, who in his last year as a Dodger, also threw a no-hitter that night. That was the first time that occurred since 1898, and it was just such an amazing night for baseball. And when I see these two rookies, Dave Stewart and Valenzuela here, it takes me right back to that night and being a kid again and watching that A's-Toronto game and then finding out later on what Fernando did. And I'm just blessed to have these memories of those childhood trips and how sports cards and comic books and just pop culture played an important part in marking those times of my life. So everybody have a great weekend. I do plan on doing another video probably this weekend because I'm taking some days off. And I'll probably do one on my AFL case build or some new additions to my collection. Take care.